What would happen if Israel were to reoccupy Gaza? We have to distinguish between two scenarios here. One is Israel occupying Gaza for a few weeks in order to eliminate Hamas's military capabilities from the territory. And the second scenario is Israel occupying Gaza for the long term, meaning years, decades, or even permanently. The first scenario is where Israel needs to focus its efforts on eliminating Hamas's military infrastructure in the Gaza Strip. It would be a tough nut to crack, but it can be done. But it's also important to recognize that there would be severe consequences for both Palestinians and Israelis. It is important to remember that the Israeli military has already conducted 3 major operations in Gaza, none of which fully eliminated Hamas's military apparatus: Operation Cast Lead in 2008, Operation Pillar of Defense in 2012, and Operation Protective Edge in 2014. None of these operations completely stopped Hamas from launching missiles into Israeli territory. The last 2 operations were focused on eliminating the tunnels beneath the Gaza Strip, which at the time was one of Hamas's main strengths. But even after these operations, Hamas still managed to rebuild and expand their tunnel network. In fact, during the recent war, Israel was taken by surprise by the extent and sophistication of Hamas's tunnels. This was despite Israel investing billions of dollars into technology to detect and stop the tunneling. So needless to say, an operation to eliminate Hamas's military capabilities in Gaza will be a very tough task. In addition to the difficulty of the mission, there are also some serious risks involved. First and foremost is the potential for civilian casualties. We saw during the recent war how much damage can be done when Israel's enemies target civilian areas like schools, hospitals, and homes. Imagine what would happen if Israel were to occupy Gaza and conduct operations against Hamas's military infrastructure. The civilian death toll could be catastrophic. Secondly, an occupation of Gaza would almost certainly lead to a humanitarian crisis. The small slice of Palestine that borders Egypt and Israel has been under blockade for the better part of 2 decades now. There are around 2 million Palestinians living in Gaza with limited access to basic services like healthcare and education. And imagine what would happen if the border crossings were to shut down completely. A full-blown humanitarian crisis is likely to occur within weeks. Thirdly, an occupation of Gaza would likely lead to more violence against Israelis both at home and abroad. Hamas has already claimed responsibility for attacks outside of the Gaza Strip, including in the West Bank, which is different than Gaza, as we saw during the recent war. There were attacks carried out in Tel Aviv, Hadera, and even at a music festival in northern Israel. Also, if Israel were to occupy Gaza, Hamas would likely retaliate by targeting Israelis abroad. This would probably include more attacks in Cyprus, Turkey, Thailand, and other countries with large numbers of Israeli tourists. The fourth risk of occupying Gaza is that it would make it nearly impossible to reach a long-term ceasefire with Hamas. The only way to end this conflict is through a political solution. But how can Israel negotiate with Hamas when it controls Gaza? A ceasefire would almost certainly violate international law, and even if Israel were able to find a way around that, the continued presence of Israeli soldiers in Gaza would make it extremely difficult to build trust between the two sides. Finally, occupying Gaza would be extremely costly for Israel. It would require tens of thousands of troops to maintain control over the densely populated territory. In addition, Israel would need to invest heavily in security measures to prevent attacks by Hamas and other militant groups. Now let's talk about the second scenario, which is Israel occupying Gaza in the long term. The short answer is that Israel cannot occupy Gaza without committing war crimes. The Geneva Convention clearly states that an occupying power must not commit acts of collective punishment against the population of the occupied territory. However, as we have seen throughout history, occupation rarely follows the rules. Israeli occupation of the West Bank, which includes East Jerusalem, has been going on for 57 years. During this time, Israel has built settlements on occupied land, restricted the movement of Palestinians, and carried out collective punishment against Palestinians in the West Bank. If Israel were to occupy Gaza, they would likely do the same things that they have been doing in the West Bank for the past half-century. In addition, Israel would face all of the risks that I outlined earlier, including the risk of more violence against Israelis both at home and abroad. Long-term occupation of Gaza would also be extremely costly for Israel, would require tens of thousands of troops to maintain control over the densely populated territory. In addition, Israel would need to invest heavily in security measures to prevent attacks by Hamas and other militant groups. And even if Israel were able to prevent attacks, the occupation would almost certainly lead to more resentment and violence down the road. We have seen this time and time again throughout history. The longer an occupying force stays in one territory, the more resentment and anger builds up among the local population. This leads to more violence and instability, which makes it even more difficult for the occupying force to leave. So what would be the point of occupying Gaza in the first place? Some may argue that Israel needs to do it in order to protect its citizens from attacks by Hamas and other militant groups. But as we have seen during the recent war, Hamas does not need to be in control of Gaza in order to launch attacks against Israel. It can use tunnels that extend from the West Bank into Israeli territory. Additionally, Hamas has launched missiles from Syria and Lebanon, so it is clear that they do not need Gaza in order to attack Israel. Others may argue that Israel needs to occupy Gaza in order to prevent the smuggling of weapons and other supplies. But as we have seen, Israel has been able to prevent the smuggling of most goods into Gaza, of course. Some weapons and supplies have made their way into Gaza, but this has not stopped Israel from carrying out major operations against Hamas. Now, let's talk about the most common argument in favor of Israel occupying Gaza: the claim that there is no Palestinian Authority in Gaza. Therefore, Israel has no choice but to occupy it. But this is not true. The Palestinian Authority does exist. It's located in Ramallah, in the West Bank. Israel just does and want to acknowledge it because Mahmoud Abbas refuses to recognize Hamas as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. However, it's important to remember that the Palestinian Authority is not just Mahmoud Abbas and his Fatah party. It's also the government of Gaza. Yes, Hamas does run Gaza, but Hamas is a member of the Palestinian Authority. Additionally, the Palestinian Legislative Council, which is the Palestinian parliament, is still in existence. It's also located in the West Bank. The last time elections were held in Palestine was in 2006. Hamas won those elections, but they did not participate in the election process in the West Bank. Since then, Mahmoud Abbas has refused to hold new elections because he is afraid that Hamas will win again. But this does not mean that the Palestinian Legislative Council is no longer in effect. According to Palestinian law, the council can remain in power indefinitely, unless new elections are held. So even though Hamas does run Gaza, it is still technically under the control of the Palestinian Authority. Therefore, Israel cannot claim that there is no Palestinian government in Gaza. It simply isn't true. So let's recap. Even a short-term occupation of Gaza by Israel will cause massive damage to both Palestinians and Israelis. It will result in countless civilian casualties, a humanitarian crisis, more attacks against Israelis, and a higher cost for Israel. Long-term occupation is even worse. It will result in war crimes being committed against Palestinians, more resentment and violence, as well as an even higher cost for Israel. Now, there is a third option, which is a temporary occupation. This means that Israel occupies Gaza for a set amount of time, such as 6 months or a year. Then after that time is up, Israel withdraws. But this is not really any better than a long-term occupation. In fact, it is even worse because it will lead to more resentment and anger among Palestinians. If Israel knows that it will only be in Gaza for a short time, it will be even more likely to commit war crimes, since it will not have to deal with the consequences. Additionally, it will be extremely difficult for Israel to withdraw from Gaza after committing war crimes. It will be seen as a complete defeat for Israel, and it will lead to more violence against Israelis. If you disagree with my analysis, please explain why. What are the benefits of Israel occupying Gaza? What would Israel gain from it? What is the purpose of the occupation? I am genuinely curious to hear your thoughts. But please do, and respond with comments like Hamas is a terrorist organization, or Israel has the right to defend itself. We all know that Hamas is a terrorist organization. No one is denying that. And of course, Israel has the right to defend itself. But that does not mean that Israel should occupy Gaza. As always, thank you for watching. If you found the video helpful, please hit the like button. It really helps me out.